Hello, everyone. My name is Fernando Cardenas of the Pan-African League Umoja. Today is June 2nd, 2024. I'm here with my co-host, Kofi, of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. Welcome to this fourth session of Mayibuye, a monthly international and Pan-African program with historian and political activist, Dr. Gerald Horne. Today's session will be dedicated to the historical and political trajectory of South Africa from colonial domination to nowadays. As we are commemorating the 30th anniversary of the election of Nelson Mandela, a president of South Africa, as president of South Africa in May 1994, which signaled the official end to the racist, white supremacist, and colonial apartheid regime. Today's session will explore the lessons of the anti-colonial struggle in South Africa. We will also discuss the outcome of the elections that were held earlier this week. This session is sponsored by the Pan-African League Umoja, the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, and Activist News Network. Today, we're honored and privileged to be joined by a very special guest. Our guest is historian and longtime political activist in anti-racism, Pan-African, and working-class struggles. He holds the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific authors of our time. He has written over 40 books on a wide range of issues, including Black internationalism, the music and film industry, imperialism, class struggles, settler colonialism, and white supremacy. His most recent books include Acknowledging Radical Histories, Conversations with Chris Steele, and I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne Reader, which is a collection of essays he has written over the past 3 decades. His forthcoming book, which is already available for pre-order, is titled Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Dr. Gerald Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show The Horne Report on Diasporic Music, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. He's also the co-producer and host of Freedom Now, a weekly Pan-African internationalist and anti-imperialist program, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific and can be found at kpfk.org. Both shows replay on Activist News Network YouTube channel. Gerald Horne has received several awards, including the 2021 American Book Award for his book titled The Dawning of the Apocalypse: The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism, and Capitalism in the long 60th century, and the Frantz Fanon Lifetime Achievement Award granted by the Caribbean Philosophical Association in 2023. Gerald Horne is obviously no stranger to the topic that will be discussed today. He's the author of 2 books on settler colonialism and anti-colonial resistance in Southern Africa, including From the Barrel of a Gun, the United States and the War Against Zimbabwe, 1965 to 1980, which was published over 2 decades ago, and White Supremacy Confronted, U.S. Imperialism and Anti-Communism versus the Liberation of Southern Africa, from Rhodes to Mandela, an 850-page long book that was published in 2019. As a student, Gerald Horne was involved in the campus protests against U.S. support to the apartheid state. Then as an attorney, he defended the students who were repressed for their anti-apartheid activism. During this time, as the president of the National Conference of Black Lawyers, NCBL, in the 1980s, Gerald Horne was at the forefront of the anti-apartheid struggle in the United States. And finally, we also wanted to highlight that Mayibuye, the name of this monthly internationalist and Pan-Africanist program, is a tribute and appreciation to Dr. Horne's involvement in the anti-apartheid movement and the struggle for the liberation of Southern Africa. Indeed, Mayibuye was a sequence of protests and demonstrations organized by the liberation movements in Southern Africa in 1952. Mayibuye, Africa, come back, Africa, was also a catchphrase and popular song during the anti-apartheid struggle. Dr. Gerald Horne, thank you so much for joining us and welcome back to Mayibuye.
Thank you for inviting me. And let me first of all apologize because I'm a little under the weather. And as a result, I may have to go off camera occasionally and may even have to abort this fine session early. Hopefully that will not happen. Let me also add a few notes to your expansive introduction.
Please.
That is to say that to write that book on Zimbabwe, I lived in Zimbabwe in 1995, which obviously is shortly after the coming to independence of South Africa. And to do the book on Southern Africa, White Supremacy Confronted, I did extensive research in South Africa, not least in Fort Hare University, the alma mater of Robert Mugabe, Nelson Mandela, and others, which holds the archives of the ANC. And it's an extensive and elaborate archive that I recommend to researchers. And I also did research in Cape Town, which has fine archives as well, particularly at the University of Cape Town. Now, the way we'll proceed is that I'll first tackle the pressing issue, which is the 2024 election in South Africa. And then I'll provide some context for that result before adverting to a historical survey of how we reached this moment in June 2024. Now, with regard to the 2024 election, the African National Congress, which has been ruling since 1994, apparently suffered a stinging setback. Its majority has disappeared. The Democratic Alliance, the neo-apartheid party, comprised disproportionately of settlers, got 20+% of the vote. And what's ironic is that the party knocked together by former ANC. Okay, fine. The party organized by former South African President Jacob Zuma got 14 to 15% of the vote, although apparently legal regulations will prevent him from serving politically. And this is ironic because I would argue that South Africa began a precipitous decline precisely during the time of Jacob Zuma's presidency. From about 2009 till about 2018, 2019, official reports spoke about state capture. That is to say, Mr. Zuma and his comrades are turning over state coffers to cronies and other corrupt elements, some of whom are in exile now, particularly the notorious Gupta brothers. And far be it from me to comment on one's personal life, but I have to say that in light of the fact that Mr. Zuma has, at last count, about 4 wives and numerous children, this opens up the door for all manner of corruption in order to feed those many mouths. Not to mention the fact that in terms of the MK platform, in addition to populist measures such as nationalization of the means of production, he tossed in some rather head-scratching conservative measures, such as exiling pregnant teenage girls to Robben Island, where ANC prisoners were once housed, which is very curious, since Mr. Zuma barely escaped a successful prosecution for rape of a young daughter of a comrade some years ago. And then you have another party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, led by Julius Malema, who led the charge, quite frankly, that put Mr. Zuma in power and led to the dislodging of the second South African president, Thabo Mbeki. Of course, Mr. Malema also has faced charges of corruption, and his party attained about 9 to 10% of the vote. So if you look overall, with the 40 of the ANC, the 14 to 15 of the MK party, and the 10% of the EFF of Mr. Malema, you'll see that there is a still substantial majority, I would argue, for transformation of South Africa. Now, whether or not the ANC will go into coalition with those latter two parties is an open question. There's quite a bit of bad blood between and amongst them. The MK party says that a condition of their going into coalition with the ANC would be dislodging the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who replaced Jacob Zuma a few years back. The Economic Freedom Fighters has no conditioned president in that regard, although Mr. Malema has expressed disdain in the past for Mr. Ramaphosa. The wider context is that US imperialism was quite hostile to the ANC government, not least because the ANC government brought a case before the International Court of Justice, dragging US ally Israel into the dock, making out a plausible case for genocide against Palestinians. This has led inexorably to the International Criminal Court applying for a warrant for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and a number of members of his war cabinet, including Yoav Gallant, his chief military advisor. This is a turnabout for the ICC, which has developed a notorious reputation for going after African leaders, not to mention leaders of formerly socialist Yugoslavia. The US is also, that is to say, US imperialism has been hostile to South Africa because of their perception that South Africa has been lethargic in condemning the Russian intervention in Ukraine. And indeed, South Africa is a member of good standing of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which is challenging the US-led Group of Seven with Canada, the Western European nations, plus Japan. Also, US imperialism has been hostile to the ANC government because when you had land reform in neighboring Zimbabwe, the US and its allies slapped sanctions on Zimbabwe and expected South Africa to follow suit. Mr. Zuma hinted that he would, but then did not. And of course, that was not pleasing to US imperialism. Just recently, US imperialism has lifted sanctions or eased sanctions against the country of Zimbabwe and tightening sanctions against the leaders. This is a response to the fact that Zimbabwe is a storehouse of minerals essential for the green economy, lithium not least, which South African-born billionaire Elon Musk says having lithium is basically a license to print money. The overriding issue, it seems to me, in analyzing not only South Africa and the global majority and the global South more generally, including Palestine, is that when you had the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, this removed from the playing field the chief ally of the liberation forces, including the ANC, including the Palestine Liberation Organization. And therefore, it forced liberation organizations to make difficult compromises. There are those who suggest that the difficult compromise that the ANC made leading to elections in 1994, that those compromises were not necessary. It has been argued But if you look, as I did at some length, at the run-up to negotiations, and indeed the unbanning of Mandela and the ANC leaders in February 1990, it's clear that apartheid's last leader, F.W. de Klerk, made the calculation that the ANC would be handicapped and hampered in negotiating because its main ally that had armed them to the teeth, speaking of the Soviet Union and secondarily the socialist East Germany, were in the process of decomposing. And the same holds true for the PLO and the Oslo process. Even though if you look at some of the analyses made by our Palestinian comrades with regard to the compromises made in the Oslo process, many of them do not even deign to mention the collapse of the Soviet Union, which I think is evidentiary of an inadequate analysis. Now, another part of the context is that here in North America, even though there was quite a bit of subsequent rhetorical cheerleading for the apparent demise of apartheid, the fact is that the major ideological trends, liberalism as reflected in the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and a certain kind of Black nationalism were not necessarily embracing of the ANC because for various reasons, they did not like the fact that the ANC was in an alliance with the South African Communist Party, particularly the NAACP, which tossed overboard during the 1950s its left and communist-oriented leaders, including its founder, W.E.B. Du Bois, including the late, great Paul Robeson, to name a few. And of course, many of the Black nationalists were not fond of the Communist Party of South Africa for various reasons that we can go into subsequently. Now let's now reel back to the origins of settler colonialism at the southern tip of Africa, commencing in the middle of the 17th century, 1652 to be precise, when Dutch Protestants landed at the southern tip of the continent, quickly followed by French Protestants in the process of being expelled from heavily, predominantly Catholic France. These French Protestants were expert in enslaving Africans and therefore had a lot of work to do upon arriving at the southern tip of Africa. That is to say, just like the settler colonial project in North America, also commencing in the 17th century, with enslavement of Africans being its calling card, the same could be said to a certain degree for the settlers in the southern tip of Africa, who enslaved Mozambicans in particular, but not only Mozambicans, they strayed as far as what is today's Indonesia to manacle and handcuff and drag across the Indian Ocean those poor souls to be enslaved. And indeed, if you look at the current demography of South Africa, you'll find that there's not only an African population, the majority, a European settler population of about 5 to 6 million, dwarfing the settler population in neighboring Zimbabwe, which is only about, at best, 200,000, which is probably an exaggerated estimate. But you also have a South Asian population, particularly along the Indian Ocean coast. In Durban, that's a result of British colonialism, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then, to cut to the chase, you have a so-called colored population, which is not only a mixture of African and European, but also it's a mixture that involves the indigenous inhabitants of what is now Indonesia, combining with Europeans, combining with Africans, etc. And of course, at the beginning of the 19th century, Dutch colonialism is on a steep decline. It's ousted from ruling that part of Africa by British colonialists, who has noted, as it has been their tendency, beginning to import South Asians to the southern tip of Africa. We did something similar in Trinidad and Tobago, which they take over at the similar moment. That's in the Caribbean. They do something similar in Fiji, in the South Seas, which I deal with in my book, The White Pacific. But what happens, unfortunately for the exploiters in London, is that the Haitian Revolution erupts simultaneous with the Dutch ouster from the southern tip of Africa by the British. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, ignites a general crisis of the entire slave system, including in Jamaica, Barbados, and other slave islands in the Caribbean. And so what you see is that London decides that the better part of wisdom was to move in 1808 to curtail its role in the African slave trade, concluding that by bringing more Africans across the Atlantic, they were just basically bringing more grave diggers for the system of sugar-based slave economies. That was followed in the 1830s by London abolishing slavery altogether, also at the southern tip of Africa, which leads to what's called the Great Trek, as the Afrikaners, this is the name affixed to this combination of Dutch and French Protestants. The Afrikaners tried to escape the remit and jurisdiction of London by moving north. That is only partially successful, and it leads in the 1890s to the so-called Anglo-Boer War, a war between the British and the Afrikaners, or the Boers, to use another term for them, B-O-E-R. And the Afrikaners were defeated, although they quickly reconcile with London and formed the Union of South Africa in 1910, although it's fair to say, as I say in the book, that one of the complications in terms of the Afrikaners maintaining rule is that even though they purported to be white supremacists, they were actually just Afrikaner nationalists, as embodied in their continuing hostility to the British, as embodied in their hostility to Jewish migrants flooding into the country at the same time, the beginning of the 20th century, particularly from Lithuania, the now independent Baltic Republic, rather than embracing these Jewish migrants as the North American peers of the Afrikaners tended to do, incorporating them into this overarching identity politics of whiteness. The Afrikaners, who at the same time were trying to forge a coalition with Nazi Germany, which was coming to power in the 1920s before succeeding in the 1930s, the Afrikaners, to put it mildly, turned their back on Jewish migrants. At the same time, you have contrasting developments. The ANC is formed in 1912. In 1917, you have the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution. And for reasons that we can go into if you're interested, the successful Bolsheviks begin to support national liberation movements, not least in South Africa. They have comrades there because shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution, you have the founding of what is now the South African Communist Party. And after a few missteps, they begin to incorporate Africans at the highest levels of that particular organization, which was necessary because, as noted, the Afrikaners were forging an alliance with fascist Germany and fascist Italy, culminating in 1948 with the official proclamation of the apartheid system. which is a legal system of racism, a legal system of what's called Jim Crow in the United States, a legal system that tends to denaturalize or remove the citizenship of none of any who were not in this category, amorphous category of whiteness. It was also an attempt to further enforce and install what has come to be the hallmark of settler colonialism, which is class collaboration. That is to say, the rulers of South Africa were quite concerned with poor Afrikaners joining hands with poor Africans in a class-based alliance. And apartheid was meant to uplift economically and socially poor Afrikaners. And to an extent, that's worked, as evidenced by the fact that the neo-apartheid party, referenced a few moments ago, the Democratic Alliance, got 20+% of the vote just a few days ago in South Africa, almost all of whom were settlers, almost all of whom were from various and diverse class backgrounds. So this attempt to blunt class alliances succeeded to a degree, although I should add very quickly that because of pre-existing anti-Jewish fervor, some of the leaders of the South African Communist Party and the ANC happened to be of Jewish ancestry, including Joe Slovo, Lithuanian Jewish descent, who for a while led the armed wing of the ANC. Ronnie Casseroles, who wrote a very interesting memoir, Armed and Dangerous, Still in the Land of the Living, etc. So what's happening as South Africa is descending into the dark night of post-apartheid, across the Atlantic, you see that the Black Liberation Movement, unlike the ANC, decides to capitulate to anti-communism, as noted, tossing overboard many of its left-wing leaders, including Paul Robeson. Shortly thereafter, you see the ANC leadership and South African Communist Party leadership put on trial, leading to a 28-year sentence for Nelson Mandela and many of his comrades, including Govan Mbeki, the father of the second president, Thabo Mbeki, including Walter Sisulu, perhaps Mandela's closest comrade. But alas, 1989 to 1991, you see that the Berlin Wall collapses, the socialist camp is in retreat. The US imperialism, unlike some of our friends on the left, recognize that a key to the vitality of liberation movements was assistance from the socialist camp. And so they wagered that if the socialist camp disintegrated, national liberation movements would be wounded. Now, before I go further on that line of thinking, let me digress to talk about a subject that's included in the book, the liberation movement in Angola, Southwestern Africa. Angola, a former Portuguese colony, a la Mozambique on the Indian Ocean coast. Both of these nations surging to independence in the mid-1970s. When that happens, that provides a rear base for the ANC comrades, although I should mention that Angolan independence was vouchsafed in the mid-1970s by the dispatching of Cuban troops who administered a stinging defeat on an invading apartheid army assisted by the United States of America. However, it's also fair to say that Angola suffered tremendously subsequently because the US CIA sponsored anti-communist guerrillas led by Jonas Savimbi, who was only killed about a quarter of a century ago. And therein, you begin to see the seeding of, or the acceleration of true Angolan independence. Likewise, in Mozambique, the preeminent leader, Samora Machel, died in a mysterious plane crash. although there's evidence to suggest that the apartheid authorities were responsible. This weakened the leadership. Earlier, Eduardo Mondlane, a founder of the Liberation Movement and ruling party, Frelimo, was killed under also very murky circumstances. And since that time, you've seen that US allies, particularly from the Gulf Arab states, have funded an insurgency in northern Mozambique of religious zealots who have been quite, quote, successful, unquote, causing the Maputo government to call in external forces, not least from Rwanda, to combat these religious zealots. In 1980, you saw Zimbabwe come to independence under ZANU-PF, the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front, still in power. As noted, they were subjected to sanctions because of land reform. The US and their allies made the economy scream, causing the dislodging of founding father Robert Mugabe shortly before he passed away a few years ago, and the ascension to power of Emerson Mnangagwa, still holding the reins of power. Likewise, Namibia, Southwest Africa, formerly colonized by the Germans, who exacted the first genocide of the 20th century against the Herero and Nama people about 120 odd years ago. But then after Germany was defeated in World War I, there was an illegal occupation of Namibia by the apartheid authorities, which only ceased when independence arrives in 1990. I'm happy to say that I was able to travel to Namibia shortly before independence and write a number of journalistic articles that you should also be able to find. Likewise, you had frontline states led by Zambia, a copper producer under Kenneth Kaunda, which supplied significant support to the liberation movements. Tanzania under Julius Nyerere, ditto. But to return to South Africa, the linchpin of the region, you see that after Mandela stepped down, he was replaced by his deputy, Thabo Mbeki. As noted, there was an internal uprising against Mbeki led by Julius Malema and Jacob Zuma, which led to Zuma becoming president. And as I said, I marked the decline of South Africa from Zuma's presidency. Interestingly enough, during that time, Malema said that he would kill for Jacob Zuma. And even to this very day, I think it's fair to say that the relations between the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, and Mr. Zuma's party remain close. However, let me conclude by saying that South Africa is entering uncharted waters with this recent election. It's unclear who the ANC, still the largest party, choose to go into coalition with. But in any case, whatever choice they make, they're probably going to alienate certain members of their base. So I'll stop there and take comments and or questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. As you mentioned all these facts that are listed in your book, we wanted to know how exactly you decided to write this critically important book, White Supremacy Confronted, US Imperialism and Anticolonialism versus the Liberation of South Africa from Rhodes to Mandela. How did that book come about and why did you write it?
Well, my job is to write books, number one. Number two, I thought I had something to contribute, something to say, since, as your introduction suggested, I've been active in the movement, and I thought it would be helpful to the movement to have a sweeping history of the events that led up to independence in 1994. So that's basically the origin story.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. In your book, White Supremacy Confronted, you describe how the governments and private firms from the US, which heavily invested in apartheid South Africa, played a decisive role not only in providing the blueprint for apartheid and settler colonialism, but also helping maintain it. One of the examples that you give is the Carnage report on the poor white problem in the 1930s. Can you talk about the significance of US imperialism's contribution to originating and maintaining apartheid and settler colonialism?
Well, there was camaraderie between settler colonial projects, be they in historic Palestine, North America, or the southern tip of Africa. You had forces, individuals who traveled between and amongst those particular regions. You had corporations that were involved in. However, I'm going to have to stop because my illness is overtaking me and I may have to leave. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.
Okay, Dr. Horne. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Horne.
Thank you very much, Dr. Horne. And he's still with us.
Yeah, Dr. Horne is a little bit under the weather.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Dr. Horne, and stay safe.
Yeah, we appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was shorter than expected, but that was a very interesting sum up of the recent elections, which I think we proved very informative and useful to all of us there who could attend today. Any last words for you, Fernando or Bruno?
No, I think, like you said, it was a very informative session. Unfortunately, Dr. Horne was not in a very good shape today, so we hope that he'll get back soon, and wishing him the best to recover his health as soon as possible. And we're still grateful to him for still trying to make it, despite the fact that he's not very feeling very well today. And this also shows that he's always willing to contribute to increasing our knowledge on essential fights that were carried out by our ancestors that we still have to carry out nowadays. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and please do not forget Dr. Horne in your wishes, in your prayers, and we hope that he will get well very soon.
Definitely.
So one question, when is the next session exactly? What will be the topic? And what can our comrades who are attending today can do in the meantime to support the struggle?
Yeah, I mean, we usually schedule the following sessions after the end of the each episode of Mayibuye. So, to support, they can follow Dr. Horne, Dr. Gerald Horne Facebook and Instagram pages. They can also subscribe to the Activist News Network YouTube channel. And follow the All African People of Revolutionary Party in the social media, Instagram, Facebook, whatever. And yeah, I mean, Dr. Horne is all over the place. You can also order his books. Some of the books that we've been discussing so far. So this is the fourth session. We've discussed the first session was on Paul Robeson. So Dr. Horne has actually written a biography of Paul Robeson a few years ago. Second session was on the revolutionary lives of Charlie Graham Du Bois. He also wrote a biography of Charlie Graham Du Bois in the early, I guess it was in 2004. And third session was on Haiti. He also wrote a book on the Black Jacobins, confronting the Black Jacobins. And today, as it was pointed out in the introduction, Dr. Horne has written 3 books on settler colonialism in Africa, 2 of which have been mentioned by Fernando in his introduction. So the first one is From the Barrel of a Gun, U.S. imperialism, U.S. war against Zimbabwe in 1965, 1980. And the second one is white supremacy confronted, that has been discussed during the session. So white supremacy confronted, U.S. imperialism and anti-communism versus liberation of Southern Africa, from Rhodes to Mandela. So 850-page book, 850-page long book on the settler colonialism and resistance, anti-colonial resistance in Southern Africa. Basically covering the history of that part of the world, from the early times of colonial domination by the Dutch and the French Protestants to 1994, and even beyond that. So the book has been published in 2019, and for those who will have an opportunity to read the book, you will also notice that the first pages were actually a tribute to Dr. Gerald Horne by Toivo. I hope I pronounced it correctly, but he was one of the leaders of SWAPO, the Southwest Africa People Organization, the liberation movement in Namibia. And Toivo, I hope the pronunciation is correct, is actually crediting Dr. Horne. So in the first page of the book, for the tremendous work that he has done as an activist who was as a lawyer and also political activist who was engaged in the liberation struggle in Southern Africa. And I should also point out, this is something that we had planned to discuss. It's mentioned in the book. Dr. Horne has been a direct target of the pro-apartheid and pro-Israel lobby, which is basically the same thing, because Israel has been one of the key allies of South Africa during the apartheid period. So the organization he was presiding at that time, the National Conference of Black Lawyers, has been the victim, target of smear campaigns and demonization by the Israel lobby. And actually, Dr. Horne has even been a victim of the spying activities of the Israel lobby. So there was that spy was recruited by the Anti-Defamation League, one of the pillars of the Israel lobby in the US, who was actually spying on Dr. Horne on behalf of the Israeli government and the South African government. So yeah, so this session was also aimed at paying a tribute to and showing appreciation to to Dr. Horne for all the work he's been doing, the risk he's been taking as a lawyer, as a political activist, to set our people free. So we hope that we'll have other opportunities to delve further into Dr. Horne's own involvement in that anti-apartheid campaign. And lastly, I also wanted to recommend the audience for those who can, to read one of his latest books that was mentioned by Fernando in the introduction. So it's I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne reader that people can find basically on all platforms. And there is a whole chapter on the involvement of the National Conference of Black Lawyers and Black Americans generally in the anti-apartheid struggle. I don't have the title in mind of the chapter, the article, but you can find it in the Gerald Horne reader. So thank you everyone for joining.
Yeah, again,
And,
thanks. Thank you. And I just want to, make sure if you missed one of the first 3 Mayibuyes, go back. They're on YouTube on Activist News Network, and definitely take a look at them. And we look forward to seeing you next month.
Yeah, thank you everyone, and see you soon.
Amen forever.
Thank you.